The first time I realized they needed my reaction, I decided not to give it to them. It happened on a Sunday evening at exactly 6:12 p.m., the kind of early fall night when the light fades slowly over the backyard maple tree and everything looks softer than it really is. Claire had invited 2 couples from the neighborhood for dinner, and I had been asked, politely, of course, to join them. I wore my cream cardigan, the one Daniel bought me for Mother's Day 3 years ago, and I sat at the far end of the dining table that once belonged to my husband, Thomas. The house still carries his name on the deed. I sometimes run my hand across the wood grain just to remind myself of that. Claire was radiant in that careful way she has, smiling just a second too long, laughing just a little too brightly. "Margaret's thinking about downsizing," she said casually, pouring more wine into Mrs. Palmer's glass. "A big house like this is just too much for one person." She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. I felt the eyes turn toward me, curious, sympathetic, waiting. I folded my napkin once. Then again. "Is that so?" Mr. Palmer asked. Daniel shifted in his chair. He cleared his throat, but said nothing. That was when I understood. This wasn't conversation. It was staging. They wanted me to protest, to claim my space, to sound defensive. They needed a scene, even a small one, something they could later describe as concern for my well-being. "We just worry about her being alone," Claire added gently. Alone. The word lingered in the air like dust in a beam of light. I looked at my son, 42 years old, broad shoulders, thinning hair at the temples, the same blue eyes his father had. He avoided mine. That told me everything. They had already discussed it, already agreed on the narrative. I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger, not even hurt. Clarity. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. I hadn't realized I'd made a decision, I said evenly. Not sharp, not defensive, just factual. Claire blinked. A flicker, almost imperceptible. She had expected heat, or tears, or at least confusion. Instead, she got stillness. The rest of dinner unfolded in careful politeness. Stories about school fundraisers, property, taxes going up by nearly 8% this year, the rising cost of assisted living facilities 2 towns over. I listened. I nodded when appropriate. I asked Mrs. Palmer about her garden. I complimented the lemon tart. And I watched. Every time Claire mentioned safety, maintenance, or what's best long-term, she glanced at me from the corner of her eye. Measuring. Waiting. When the guests finally left and Daniel began stacking plates in the kitchen, Claire approached me by the sink. "We just want you to be happy," she said softly. I dried my hands on a dish towel and met her gaze for the first time all evening. "I am," I replied. That was the moment I knew. They didn't want my happiness. They wanted my reaction, and I had just withheld it. The house was quiet the next morning in a way that felt deliberate, as if even the walls were waiting to see what I would do. I woke up at 5:30, the same time I have woken up for the past 38 years, and I made coffee in the kitchen, Thomas, and I remodeled when Daniel was in high school. The tile still has a faint crack near the stove from the day Daniel dropped a cast iron skillet and swore it was not his fault. I stood there with my mug warming my hands, listening to the refrigerator hum, and I replayed every word from the night before. Downsizing. Safety. What is best long-term? They were careful words. Clean words. Words that sound like concern when repeated to friends. I rinsed my cup and placed it on the drying rack, exactly where it has always gone. Then I noticed something small. The folder that usually sat on the corner of the kitchen desk was missing. It held utility bills, property tax statements, and a copy of the homeowner insurance policy. Nothing dramatic. Just paperwork. I opened the drawer beneath the desk. Empty. I checked the cabinet above the microwave. Not there. I felt that tightening again. Not panic, not anger. Awareness. Daniel came downstairs around 7, already dressed for work, his tie slightly crooked the way it always is before I fix it. He hesitated when he saw me at the table. "Morning, Mom," he said, reaching for the coffee pot. His tone was light, but his shoulders were stiff. "Good morning," I replied. I watched as he poured his cup and glanced toward the desk. He noticed the empty corner. "Claire was organizing some things," he added quickly. Organizing. Another careful word. "That is thoughtful," I said. He nodded, relieved, and left the kitchen without meeting my eyes. I waited until I heard his car back out of the driveway before I walked upstairs to my bedroom. The sunlight was thin through the curtains, pale and quiet. I opened my closet and reached for the small fireproof box on the top shelf. Inside were the original deed, the trust documents Thomas and I signed 15 years ago, and the letter from our attorney confirming that the property remained solely in my name after his passing. I sat on the edge of the bed and read the first page slowly, tracing the date with my finger. The ink had not faded. Neither had my memory. Thomas had insisted on clarity. "You never know who will need reminding," he had said. At the time, I thought he meant strangers. I closed the box and returned it to the shelf. When Claire came home around noon, she moved with a purpose that felt rehearsed. She carried a stack of brochures from the dining table into the living room and spread them neatly across the coffee table. Photographs of smiling retirees on walking trails. Floor plans with one-bedroom units measuring 800 square feet. Amenities listed in bold: transportation services, community dining, 24-hour assistance. "I picked up a few options," she said brightly when she saw me standing in the doorway. "Just so you can look." I stepped forward and studied the glossy pages. Everything was tidy, contained, manageable. "They look lovely," I said. Claire searched my face for something more. Resistance, gratitude, fear. I gave her none of it. She blinked once, then twice, and for the first time since this began, I saw the faintest crack in her composure. They were building a case, a narrative, a story about a fragile woman who needed guidance. What they did not realize was that I was reading the script before they finished writing it. By Wednesday afternoon, the air inside the house felt thinner, as if the square footage had quietly shrunk overnight. I moved through each room slowly, not because I was confused, but because I was cataloging. The hallway closet, where Thomas kept his winter coats, now held 3 empty storage bins labeled in Claire's handwriting. The linen cabinet had been rearranged so that my older towels were folded on the top shelf, out of easy reach, while newer sets were stacked neatly at eye level. It was subtle, thoughtful even, but it was not accidental. After lunch, I decided to take a walk around the block, just under a mile if you follow the full loop past the elementary school and back along Cedar Street. The sky was clear, the kind of bright blue that makes everything look uncomplicated. Mrs. Henderson was watering her hydrangeas when I passed her driveway. She waved me over with a small tilt of her head. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" she said, lowering the hose. I smiled. "Of course." She hesitated, then spoke carefully. "I ran into Claire at the mailbox yesterday. She mentioned you might be listing the house soon. Said you were looking at communities about 20 minutes from here." I held her gaze. 20 minutes. That was new. Claire had not set a distance to me. "That is interesting," I replied. I had not committed to anything. Mrs. Henderson shifted her weight. "I just wanted to make sure everything is all right. You and Thomas built that deck yourselves, you know." I remember the summer heat. So did I. 93 degrees that July. Thomas with a tape measure hooked to his belt. Daniel hammering nails crooked and laughing when we teased him. I thanked her for telling me and continued walking. By the time I reached the stop sign at the end of Cedar Street, the pattern was clearer. They were not just preparing me. They were preparing the neighborhood. A gentle narrative. A concerned son. A practical daughter-in-law. A widowed mother who needed less space. I returned home and found Claire at the kitchen counter with her laptop open. A spreadsheet glowed on the screen. Columns labeled expenses, projected sale value, estimated equity. She closed it quickly when she noticed me, but not quickly enough. "I was just comparing property taxes," she said lightly. "They have gone up almost 9% in 3 years." I pulled out a chair and sat down. "Yes," I said. "I read the county report last month." Her fingers paused on the keyboard. Silence settled between us, steady and unhurried. She was waiting for protest, for emotion, for a sign that her calculations had unsettled me. Instead, I asked, "Have you considered capital gains implications if the title changes?" The question landed softly, but it landed. Claire blinked, then forced a small smile. "Daniel and I are just exploring options." Exploring. There it was again. I nodded once and stood, smoothing my cardigan at the waist. Upstairs, I opened the fireproof box again, not because I doubted what it contained, but because I wanted to feel the weight of certainty in my hands. The deed was still in my name. The trust still intact. The signatures still clear. They were building momentum. Conversations with neighbors. Brochures on the table. Spreadsheets on a screen. What they did not yet understand was that momentum without control is only motion. And I had not surrendered control. On Thursday evening, Daniel suggested we all sit down together, just the 3 of us, as if the house itself required mediation. He chose the dining room again. The same long table, the same overhead light casting a soft yellow circle over the polished wood. Claire brought a yellow legal pad and a pen, placing them neatly in front of her seat. It was a small detail, but it told me everything. This was not a conversation. It was documentation. I took my usual chair at the end of the table and folded my hands in my lap. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, we just want to talk through some practical things," he began. Practical. Another careful word. Claire nodded in agreement, her expression composed, sympathetic. "We have been thinking about the future," she said. "About what makes sense financially and logistically." Logistically. I noticed how she paired each suggestion with a tone of concern, as though she were presenting options to someone fragile. Daniel slid a single sheet of paper toward me. On it were 3 columns: stay and renovate, sell and relocate, transition to senior living. Beneath each heading were bullet points: estimated costs, projected savings, notes about maintenance and emergency response times. They had done their homework. "We are not pushing," Daniel added quickly. "We just want you to feel supported." Supported. I studied the paper without touching it. The numbers were tidy, rounded to the nearest thousand. The renovation estimate assumed accessibility modifications I had never requested. The relocation option listed communities within a 30-mile radius. I recognized one of the names from the brochure on the coffee table. Claire leaned forward slightly. "It is just that this house is over 3,000 square feet," she said gently. "It is a lot for one person." I let the silence stretch. I thought of Thomas measuring those square feet himself, arguing with the contractor about ceiling height, insisting on solid oak doors instead of hollow core. I thought of Daniel running through these hallways in stocking feet, leaving scuff marks on the baseboards that I never quite managed to paint over. "I have managed it for 12 years, I said evenly. 12 years since Thomas passed. 12 years of property taxes paid on time. 12 years of repairs scheduled, gutters cleaned, furnace serviced before winter." Daniel shifted in his seat. "We just worry about emergencies," he said. "What if something happens?" There it was. The soft suggestion of incapacity. The gentle framing of risk. I met his eyes steadily. "If something happens, I will handle it the way I always have," I replied. Claire's pen hovered above the legal pad, as though she had expected a longer answer. Perhaps even an emotional one. Instead, she wrote something down. A single line. I wondered what the summary would say later. Resistant. In denial. Needs guidance. The meeting lasted 37 minutes. I noticed because I glanced at the wall clock when Daniel said, "Let us revisit this in a week." Revisit. As if a decision had already been set in motion. When I stood to leave, Claire gathered the papers carefully and stacked them into a thin folder. They were building a case file. That much was clear. What they did not see was that I was building something as well. Not noise. Not argument. Something quieter. Something that would not require their agreement. Friday morning arrived with a stillness that felt almost polite, as if the house were offering me one final opportunity to comply. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy blazer I had not worn in months and a pair of low heels that clicked softly against the hardwood floors. Claire noticed immediately when I entered the kitchen. She was standing at the counter slicing strawberries, arranging them into a glass bowl with unnecessary precision. "You look nice," she said, her tone light but curious. "Do you have plans?" I poured myself a cup of coffee and added a splash of cream. "Yes," I replied. "Nothing more." She waited. I did not elaborate. Daniel came in moments later, adjusting his watch. He glanced at me, then at Claire. A silent exchange passed between them, quick and unreadable. "We were thinking," he began, as if continuing a conversation I had not agreed to join. "Maybe this weekend we could tour one of those communities. Just to get a feel for it." Claire set the knife down and leaned lightly against the counter. She was prepared for resistance. I could see it in the slight tension of her shoulders. "That sounds efficient," I said calmly. "You should absolutely gather all the information you need." Daniel frowned slightly. "Mom, it would be for you." I met his gaze. "If you find something that meets your criteria, you can let me know." The words landed gently, but they shifted the ground beneath their feet. Claire blinked, just once. She had expected protest. Or fear. Instead, she received delegation. After breakfast, I picked up my handbag and walked to my car, the silver sedan Thomas insisted we buy because it was reliable and practical. The drive across town took 18 minutes with moderate traffic, I parked in front of the brick building with the brass plaque by the entrance and stepped inside. The receptionist greeted me by name. I had called the day before. "Mr. Patterson will see you now," she said warmly. His office was quiet, lined with shelves of neatly organized binders. I sat across from him and placed a slim folder on the desk. "I would like to review my trust documents," I said. He nodded, folding his hands. "Of course, Margaret. Has something changed?" I considered the question. "No," I replied. "But I believe clarity is overdue." We spent just under an hour reviewing every page. Ownership, beneficiaries, conditions. Mr. Patterson explained the current structure in steady, measured terms. The house remained solely mine. The trust could be amended at any time. I listened carefully, asking precise questions. Not emotional ones. Practical ones. When I left his office, the autumn air felt sharper, cleaner. I did not rush home. I stopped at the grocery store and bought fresh rosemary and a loaf of sourdough bread. Ordinary things. Predictable things. When I pulled into the driveway, Claire was on the front porch speaking on her phone. She lowered it slowly as I stepped out of the car. "How was your morning?" she asked. I locked the car and looked up at the house, at the wide front windows Thomas had insisted on installing for the view of the maple tree. "Productive," I said, and for the first time since this began, I saw something new in her expression. Not confidence, not concern, uncertainty. Saturday arrived with an unexpected invitation. Claire announced at breakfast that her sister and brother-in-law would be stopping by that evening along with 2 friends from church. "Just something small," she said, spreading cream cheese across a bagel with steady strokes. "It will be good for everyone to relax." Daniel nodded in agreement, avoiding my eyes as he scrolled through his phone. I recognized the shift immediately. Public setting. Witnesses. Another opportunity to frame the narrative. I spent the afternoon in the garden trimming the edges along the stone path Thomas laid by hand 15 years ago. The air carried that crisp October scent, cool but not yet cold, around 62 degrees with a steady breeze. I worked slowly, deliberately, not because the task required it, but because patience steadies the mind. Through the kitchen window, I could see Claire moving from room to room, adjusting throw pillows, lighting candles, arranging chairs in a way that subtly positioned me at the end of the seating area rather than at its center. Small choreography. By 6:30 the house filled with voices and polite laughter. I wore the navy blazer again. Claire greeted everyone warmly, introducing me with a hand lightly resting on my shoulder. "Margaret has been thinking about making some changes," she said casually while passing a tray of sparkling water. "We are exploring options for her next chapter." The words were bright, optimistic, designed to sound progressive rather than dismissive. Her sister looked at me with gentle curiosity. "That is exciting," she said. "Have you decided where you will go?" I took a measured sip from my glass. "I have decided to review all possibilities carefully," I replied. Not defensive, not uncertain, simply composed. A faint pause followed. Claire filled it quickly. "We just want to make sure she is safe and comfortable," she added, her tone softening in a way that suggested responsibility. Daniel chimed in. "It is about planning ahead." Planning ahead. I let the phrase settle. Then I asked, "And what timeline are you working with?" The question seemed to catch them off guard. Claire blinked. "Well, nothing is finalized," she said. "We are just thinking in terms of the next few months." A few months. That was new. No one had mentioned a schedule to me. The guests shifted slightly, sensing an undercurrent they could not quite name. I smiled gently. "It is impressive how much thought you have both invested," I said. "I appreciate the initiative." The compliment unsettled them more than any protest could have. Throughout the evening, I watched the pattern repeat. Claire describing square footage as a burden. Daniel mentioning maintenance costs. Each comment angled toward me, waiting for reaction, for contradiction, for emotion that could be interpreted as instability. I offered none. I asked calm questions about insurance rates and market trends. I listened. I nodded. I remained steady. When the guests finally gathered their coats and thanked Claire for the lovely evening, I stood by the door and wished them safe drives home. As the front door closed and the house returned to silence, Daniel exhaled sharply. "That went well," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Claire studied me for a long moment. "You seem very calm about all of this," she observed. I met her gaze without hesitation. "I am," I said, and in that quiet exchange, I understood something clearly. They had expected friction. Instead, they were facing resistance of a different kind. One that did not raise its voice. One that did not argue. One that waited. On Monday morning, I moved one of my own pieces on the board. I did not announce it. I did not dramatize it. I simply called Mr. Patterson again and scheduled a follow-up appointment for Wednesday at 10:15. The house felt different after the weekend gathering, as if Daniel and Claire were recalculating something behind closed doors. I could sense it in the way their voices lowered when I entered a room, in the way Claire's laptop screen tilted away from my line of sight just a fraction too quickly. They were trying to understand why I had not reacted. People become uneasy when their expectations fail. I made breakfast as usual, oatmeal with sliced apples and cinnamon, and listened to Daniel describe a project at work that required long-term planning. He emphasized the phrase without looking at me. Planning is important, I agreed, especially when assets are involved. He paused mid-sentence, then forced a small laugh. Claire watched me over the rim of her coffee mug. There was a question in her eyes now, not about whether I would move, about what I might already know. Wednesday arrived cool and bright, 58 degrees by mid-morning. I drove downtown again, this time with a sense of quiet certainty rather than urgency. In Mr. Patterson's office, I reviewed an amended draft of my trust. We adjusted language carefully. Conditions, timelines, oversight. I added a clause requiring any major property decision to be initiated solely by me while I remained mentally competent, with written certification from 2 independent physicians required before any transition could occur. Clear, unambiguous. We also discussed a charitable remainder option benefiting the local library Thomas supported for years. Mr. Patterson looked at me steadily. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Very," I replied. The pen felt solid in my hand when I signed. Not heavy, not trembling. Steady. When I returned home that afternoon, Claire was in the living room measuring the wall above the fireplace. A tape measure stretched across the mantel. "I was thinking about rearranging the layout," she said brightly. "Maybe opening up the space." I set my handbag down carefully. "It is a beautiful fireplace," I said. "Thomas chose the stone himself." She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "Trends change." I nodded once. "Ownership does not." The words were soft. Matter of fact. Daniel came home early that evening, his expression unusually serious. "Mom, can we talk later?" he asked. I agreed. After dinner we sat again at the long table. No legal pad this time. No printed spreadsheets. Just Daniel's hands clasped together as if bracing for something unseen. "Claire and I feel like you are shutting us out," he said quietly. "I considered that. I am making decisions carefully," I replied. "That is not the same as shutting anyone out." He searched my face for frustration, for accusation. I gave him neither. Claire finally spoke. "It feels like you do not trust us." I met her gaze calmly. "Trust is built on clarity," I said. "And clarity is something I value deeply." Silence followed. Not explosive, not dramatic, just heavy enough to settle into the room. For the first time, I sensed it clearly. The balance had shifted. They no longer felt in control of the outcome. They were waiting for my next move, and that waiting unsettled them far more than any argument ever could. The next shift did not come with raised voices or dramatic declarations. It came in the form of a letter delivered by certified mail on Friday afternoon at exactly 2:43. I was the one who signed for it. The envelope bore Mr. Patterson's return address, clean and formal, in the upper left corner. Claire watched from the hallway as I set it on the kitchen counter without opening it immediately. Her eyes followed my hands the way someone watches a safe being unlocked. Daniel came home early that day, a habit he had developed whenever tension hovered in the air. We ate dinner quietly, the clink of silverware louder than usual against porcelain plates. After we finished, I carried the envelope into the dining room and took my seat at the head of the table. I did not rush. I slit the paper carefully and removed the documents inside. Claire leaned forward slightly. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I met with Mr. Patterson this week." I began evenly. We reviewed my trust and made a few clarifications. The word clarifications settled heavily between us. Claire's fingers intertwined in her lap. "What kind of clarifications?" she asked. "Not confrontational. Controlled." I slid a single page across the table toward Daniel. "The house remains solely under my authority," I said calmly. "Any decision to sell, transfer, or modify ownership requires my written consent, accompanied by independent medical confirmation of my competence only if that competence is legally questioned. Daniel scanned the page, his eyes moving faster as he processed the language. Claire remained still, but the color in her cheeks shifted slightly. No one was questioning your competence, Daniel said quickly. Of course not, I replied. This simply prevents future misunderstandings. I paused just long enough for the weight of that phrase to register. In addition, I continued, I have designated a portion of the estate to the Whitmore Community Library in Thomas's name, effective immediately upon my passing. Claire's head lifted sharply. A portion, she repeated. A significant one, I answered. Thomas believed in legacy. So do I. Silence expanded across the table, thick but contained. Daniel folded the paper carefully, aligning the edges. With precision. Why would you do this without talking to us? He asked quietly. I met his gaze without hesitation. Because the assets in question are mine, I said. And because clarity protects everyone involved. Claire's composure flickered for the briefest second. We were only trying to help, she insisted. I understand, I replied. And I appreciate your concern. But help is not the same as control. The word control lingered in the air. No one raised their voice. No one slammed a hand against the table. The tension existed in the spaces between breaths. I gathered the documents neatly and placed them back inside the envelope. There will be no timeline, I said gently. No assumptions. If I decide to move one day, it will be because I choose to. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Claire looked at me as if recalculating an equation that no longer balanced. For weeks they had prepared a narrative in which I was passive, uncertain, in need of guidance. That narrative dissolved quietly in that room. Not because I argued, not because I resisted loudly, but because I had acted first. And when I stood to return the envelope to my bedroom, neither of them followed. The house settled into a new rhythm after that evening. Not louder, not quieter, simply recalibrated. On Sunday morning, I rose before sunrise and stood at the front window with a cup of coffee, watching the light stretch slowly across the lawn. The maple tree in the yard had begun to turn, its leaves deep red along the edges. Change was happening, but it was seasonal, natural, not forced. Behind me, I heard the soft creak of the staircase. Daniel paused at the bottom step, as if unsure whether to enter the kitchen or retreat. Morning, Mom, he said carefully. Good morning, I replied without turning around. He joined me by the window, folding his arms across his chest. For a long moment we stood in silence. Finally he spoke. I did not mean for things to feel adversarial. The words sounded foreign in his mouth. I considered it. They do not, I said calmly. They feel clarified. He exhaled slowly, absorbing that. Claire thought we were being proactive, he added. I know, I answered. And I am being deliberate. There was a difference, and he could feel it now. Later that afternoon, Claire approached me in the living room while I was reading. She sat across from me rather than beside me. The distance was subtle but intentional. I may have overstepped, she said, her voice controlled but softer than before. I closed my book gently and met her eyes. You assumed urgency, I replied. There was none. She nodded once. For the first time since this began, she did not attempt to reframe the situation with polished language. She simply sat there, quiet. The following week no new brochures appeared on the coffee table. No spreadsheets were left open on the counter. Conversations shifted to neutral topics. The rising cost of groceries, the upcoming school fundraiser at church, the forecast predicting a colder than average winter. The pressure dissolved not because they had won or because I had lost, but because the dynamic had changed. They had expected emotion to justify acceleration. They had expected protest to validate intervention. What they encountered instead was steadiness. And steadiness offers no leverage. On Thursday evening, I invited them both to sit with me on the back deck Thomas built. The temperature hovered around 60 degrees, cool enough for light sweaters. I rested my hands on the wooden railing and looked out over the yard. This house holds history, I said quietly. Not just mine. Yours as well. Daniel nodded. Claire remained attentive. One day, I continued, I may choose something smaller. Or I may not. But that choice will never be extracted from me. It will be given. The words were not sharp. They were final. Daniel's shoulders relaxed in a way I had not seen in weeks. Claire looked at me steadily, as if reassessing the outline of a woman she had misjudged. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I did not demand apology. I simply maintained the boundary I had drawn. That was enough. Because in the end, they did not need my tears. They did not need my fear. They needed my collapse to complete their narrative. And when it did not come, everything else unraveled quietly on its own.